It had been years since anyone spoke of the locked door in the old house. The house that sat at the end of the winding road, perched on a hill, surrounded by gnarled trees that whispered in the wind. Its walls were thick with the kind of silence only time could create. The kind of silence that would make anyone who ventured too close feel as though they were being watched. Sophie hadn't thought about the door in years. Not until she moved back in. She had inherited the house from her late aunt, a woman whose eccentricities were as well known as her wealth. The house had always been a place of strange memories, a home that felt more like a museum, with its creaking floors, dusty portraits, and strange collections from all over the world. But it wasn't just the eccentricities that lingered in Sophie's mind. It was the door that no one dared open. The door that seemed to hold more mystery than the entire house combined. Sophie had spent the past few days unpacking her things, attempting to make the house feel more like a home again. The grand, dark oak furniture, the heavy drapes, and the towering bookshelves had always intimidated her as a child, but now they seemed almost comforting. She couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched, though. There was something about the house, something not quite right. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, had warned her about the door. "Don't you ever go near it, Miss Sophie," she had said with an air of finality when Sophie first mentioned it. "It's best left untouched." Sophie had laughed at her, dismissing her warnings as nothing more than superstitions. She didn't believe in such things. Not really. But as the days went by, the door called to her in ways she couldn't explain. It was at the end of a long corridor, tucked away in a corner that hardly anyone noticed. The door itself was strange, plain, unassuming, and locked. But there was something about the way the house seemed to avoid it, like it didn't want to acknowledge its existence. The door was always a part of the house's landscape, yet never part of the conversation. No one mentioned it. Not Mrs. Whitmore, not the neighbors, not even Sophie's aunt, who had lived there for decades. Sophie had walked past it countless times, her curiosity nagging at her more with each passing day. What could be inside? Why was it locked? That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows crept into the house, Sophie found herself standing before it. The door. She couldn't remember how she got there. It was as if her feet had moved of their own accord. Her hand hovered over the cold metal doorknob, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're being ridiculous," Sophie muttered to herself. "It's just a door." But as her fingers brushed the doorknob, a chill ran down her spine. It wasn't just the temperature of the room that felt cold. No, this was something deeper, a sensation that crawled under her skin. Something was wrong. She knew it. She had to know. With a deep breath, Sophie turned the knob. The door creaked open slowly, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. The darkness beyond the door stretched out like an abyss, suffocating her in its emptiness. For a moment, Sophie hesitated. The house felt quiet, too quiet. But then, a low, distant sound filled the air, soft, almost like whispers. Sophie stepped inside. The room was small and used, covered in dust, the air thick with the stench of mildew. She felt her way around in the dark, her breath shallow. The silence in the room was unsettling. She reached for the light switch. When the light flickered on, the room revealed its secret. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that Sophie didn't recognize. They seemed to writhe in the dim light, as if they were alive. Her gaze shifted to the center of the room. There, lying in the middle of the floor, was an old wooden chest. It was battered and worn, as if it had been there for centuries. Sophie's pulse quickened. She was drawn to it. The chest seemed to call to her, beckoning her forward. Her hands trembled as she bent down to open it. But before she could, she heard a noise. It was soft at first, just a rustling sound behind her. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She whipped around, but the room was empty. Just the shadows. Nothing else. Her breath came faster now, panic creeping in. She glanced back at the chest, her curiosity now mingling with fear. Something wasn't right. The whispers were louder now, almost pleading. Sophie reached for the chest again, her mind a blur of conflicting thoughts. She opened it. Inside was a small old mirror. The glass was cracked, the edges frayed and chipped. Sophie stared at her reflection, but something was off. Her face, it wasn't just hers. Behind her, in the mirror, a dark figure stood. It was barely visible, but Sophie could make out the shape. A shadowy, twisted figure with hollow eyes, a faint grin stretching across its face. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure began to move closer. Sophie's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She tried to turn, but her body froze. "Turn around, Sophie." A voice, soft and guttural, came from behind her. Sophie's body refused to obey. Her eyes were locked on the mirror, unable to tear herself away. The figure was now standing inches behind her, its breath cold against her neck. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room with the thing in the mirror. Sophie tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then the figure whispered again, its voice now louder and clearer. "Do you want to know what's inside?" Sophie's heart hammered in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears as the shadow behind her seemed to draw closer. She could feel its cold, intangible presence press against her skin, the air thick with a suffocating tension. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they drowned out everything else. "Do you want to know what's inside?" The voice rasped again, its cold fingers brushing against her neck. Sophie's breath hitched. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she reached for the mirror, trying to tear her gaze away from the figure standing inches behind her. The reflection in the glass seemed to warp, the edges of the shadow bending and shifting unnaturally. Her own face, wide-eyed and terrified, was just a blur beneath the presence of the dark figure. The figure grinned, its hollow eyes never leaving her. The grin stretched wider, its mouth opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, yellowed and cracked like ancient bone. "No," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling in the suffocating darkness. "I don't want to know." But the shadow didn't respond. It only grew closer, its presence more overwhelming. Sophie could feel the coldness, the unnaturalness of it, creeping into her bones, freezing her in place. The room, once so still, now seemed to shift around her. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor beneath her feet felt unstable, as though the very house were alive and shifting with malevolent intent. Her eyes flicked to the door, but it was no use. It had slammed shut, the dark wood of the entrance mocking her, as though the house had sealed her fate. A low, growling sound emanated from behind her, like the creature was speaking, but the words were too distorted to understand. Sophie's instincts screamed at her to run, to get away from the thing in the room with her, but her body refused to move. It felt as if her legs were made of stone, her feet glued to the ground. "No," Sophie gasped, her voice strangled in her throat. She had to escape, but she didn't know how. The terror was overwhelming, drowning her. Suddenly, the air grew even colder, a biting chill that cut through her like ice. She could feel something tugging at her thoughts, pulling her deeper into the dark, twisted corners of her mind. It was as if the shadow was reaching inside her, trying to take control. But then something snapped. Sophie took a sharp, desperate breath, and she forced her body to move. She backed away from the mirror, her hands scraping the walls as she stumbled backward, tripping over something. What was it? The chest. She had almost forgotten about it. Her hand shot out, grasping the edge of the wooden chest. In the dim light, she could just make out its old, cracked surface. The whispers were still there, swirling around her head, but Sophie was too terrified to listen. She could feel the figure closing in again, and without thinking, she grabbed the chest and yanked it open with a desperate force. For a moment, she froze. Inside the chest, nestled against the velvet lining, was something alive. A black, squirming mass, its shape indistinct, moving as if it had a mind of its own. Sophie recoiled, nearly falling backward as the creature inside the chest let out a low, guttural hiss, like the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot. The shadow behind her growled again, its form shifting in the corner of her vision. Sophie's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a reflection in the mirror anymore. It was real, and it was getting closer. "Get away from the chest," the voice rasped, a deep, guttural command that filled her with a new kind of terror. It was as if the very air around her was pressing down on her, suffocating her. But Sophie couldn't move. She was frozen, her body trapped in the grip of fear. The creature in the chest stirred again, its form still too blurry to fully comprehend, but Sophie could feel it. It was alive and it was waiting. Her mind raced. What was she supposed to do? How was she supposed to escape? The figure in the mirror, the creature in the chest, the door, it was all connected. She had to find out what was behind the door. She had to know what was hidden here, locked away for so long. But the more she thought about it, the more the whispers filled her head, drowning out all reason. "Open it," they urged. "Open the chest." Sophie turned, the mirror now completely forgotten. She didn't know if she was ready, but the compulsion was too strong. She had to open the chest. She had to see what it was hiding. With shaking hands, Sophie pulled the chest open further. The squirming mass inside seemed to pulse, its shape becoming clearer as her mind tried to make sense of it. It was a mass of black, twisted limbs, stretching and contracting as though it were searching for a way to escape. Then, the thing inside the chest let out a scream, a high-pitched, piercing sound that echoed through the room, a sound that seemed to cut through the very air. Sophie stumbled backward, her heart racing. The door, once locked and unyielding, began to creak. It shook as though it were trying to open on its own, the wood groaning under some unseen pressure. Sophie's eyes widened. "Help me," the voice hissed again, louder this time. The shadow in the corner began to move, its dark form twisting in the reflection of the chest. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Sophie looked at the chest, then to the door. The choice was clear. She could leave now, but the whispers and the creature would follow her. Or she could uncover the truth, the horrors that had been locked away for so long. With one final breath, Sophie made her decision. She reached for the creature. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as her fingers brushed the edge of the dark, twisted mass in the chest. The creature inside seemed to pulse, like it was alive, waiting for her to touch it, to release it. But as her hand moved closer, she felt a sharp jolt of panic surge through her. The whispers became louder, more frantic. "Open it. Open it now." The air around her grew heavy, as though the very house itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to make a decision. Sophie could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, a suffocating force that made it harder to breathe. Her mind raced, every instinct screaming at her to stop, to turn away. But she couldn't. She couldn't back out now. She had to know the truth. With trembling hands, Sophie lifted the rest of the lid, revealing the creature inside. Her stomach twisted in horror at the sight before her. It was no longer just a black, squirming mass. Now it had a shape, a grotesque, contorted figure with pale, thin limbs that twisted in unnatural angles. Its skin was an almost translucent gray, and its eyes, hollow and endless, stared back at her with an intelligence that sent chills down her spine. It was alive. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth that seemed to glisten with an otherworldly hunger. A low growl emanated from deep within its throat, the sound vibrating through the air, setting Sophie's nerves on fire. "Leave," the creature whispered, its voice dry and raspy, like old paper being torn apart. "Leave while you still can," but Sophie couldn't move. Her feet were glued to the floor, her body frozen with fear. The room seemed to darken, the walls narrowing as though the house itself were closing in on her. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and terror. Why was this thing here? Why had it been locked away? A cold hand touched her shoulder. Sophie gasped and spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the creature in the chest and the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as the wooden door seemed to shudder, as though it were trying to break free from the grip of whatever force held it shut. The whispers stopped for a moment, replaced by an eerie silence that was worse than any noise. Then, the door swung open, slowly, deliberately. Sophie's mind screamed for her to run, but her legs refused to obey. She stood there, frozen, staring at the open door, her gaze shifting to the shadowy figure standing just beyond it. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the figure seemed to be nothing more than a silhouette, a dark shape against the dim light of the hallway. But as Sophie's eyes adjusted, the figure stepped forward, and she could see it clearly. It was a man, or at least it had once been a man. His features were gaunt, his face pale and drawn, as though life had long since drained from him. His eyes, however, were full of something else, something dark and knowing, as if he had seen things that no human should ever witness. Who are you?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as though every step was calculated. Sophie's instincts screamed at her to run, but she stood frozen, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure. "Leave it alone," the man said, his voice low and hoarse, as though speaking took an immense effort. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Sophie swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What is it? What's in the chest?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the doorframe, his bony fingers wrapping around it like a vice. His eyes never left Sophie's. "You've opened the door," he said, almost as if to himself. "You've awakened it." Sophie's heart raced in her chest. "What do you mean? What's in the chest?" The man took another step forward, his face now visible in the dim light. The skin around his eyes was sunken, the veins under his skin visible like a web of dark threads. His eyes, however, were unnaturally sharp, as if they had seen things beyond the veil of reality. "It's not just a creature," he said, his voice a whisper that seemed to echo in the empty room. "It's a curse that has haunted this house for generations." Sophie's head spun. She could barely process the words. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but something about the man's presence made it hard to think clearly. He seemed wrong, like a ghost caught in the space between life and death. "What do you mean, a curse?" Sophie managed to ask. Her voice was barely a whisper, her body trembling with the weight of the moment. The man's lips curled into a twisted smile. "This house has a history," he said softly. "A history that no one here dares to speak of." Sophie's eyes flicked to the chest, where the creature's twisted form was still pulsing, waiting, watching. She could feel the weight of the man's words settling in her chest, heavy and suffocating. The figure stepped closer, so close that Sophie could feel the coldness radiating from him. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced at the door, then back at the creature in the chest. The man's words were sinking in, but the terror that filled her was making it hard to think clearly. "We're all trapped," the man said, his voice soft, almost sympathetic. "There's no way out once you've opened the door." The words hung in the air, thick with an impending dread that seemed to crush Sophie's every breath. "Then what do I do?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "How do I stop it?" The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of sorrowful resignation. "There is no stopping it," he said. "Once it's awake, it can never be put back to sleep." The room seemed to grow darker still, the air thickening around her like a weight she couldn't escape. The whispers, too, had returned, swirling around her, louder now, filling her mind with thoughts she couldn't control. Sophie's hand reached for the door, her fingers brushing against the cold wood. The man's warning rang in her ears, but she didn't care. She had to know. She had to understand. And so, with a final, desperate breath, Sophie stepped forward into the darkness. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she stepped through the door. The hallway beyond seemed to stretch into infinity, dimly lit by flickering candles that cast eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the oppressive silence pressed down on her, making her heart race. She had crossed the threshold, and now there was no turning back. Her footsteps echoed loudly, unnervingly so, as she ventured deeper into the darkness. The temperature seemed to drop, and with each passing step, Sophie felt the weight of something unseen pressing in on her from all sides. The house, once familiar to her, now felt like a prison, each room, each corner, hiding something terrible, something ancient and malevolent. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting for her to make a mistake. The man's words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the peril she had brought upon herself. Once it's awake, it can never be put back to sleep. Sophie shuddered at the thought. She had opened the door, and now she was trapped, just like the man had said. She had awakened something that should have remained locked away forever. And now the creature, whatever it was out there, lurking in the dark, hungry for more. But what could she do? She had to find answers. She had to know what was going on, what had happened to this house and the people who had lived here before her. The further Sophie walked, the more the house seemed to change. The walls, once adorned with faded paintings and photographs, now appeared to be covered in mold and rot. The air smelled rancid, like decaying wood and old, damp earth. The floor beneath her feet creaked with each step, as though the house itself were groaning under the weight of her presence. She paused, her eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of the man who had warned her. But the hallway was empty, save for the flickering candles that cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. Suddenly, a low sound, soft at first, reached her ears. It was a scratching, a faint scraping noise, like claws dragging across wood. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, and she froze in place, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, as though someone was moving toward her from the dark. Sophie's breath hitched in her throat as she turned toward the sound. Her eyes darted back and forth, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. She had to get out of here. She had to go back to the room, back to the safety of the locked door. But her feet refused to move, as though they were cemented to the spot. The scratching sound grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl, a sound that sent icy shivers crawling down Sophie's spine. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Something was coming, something horrible, She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with panic, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the door she had just come through. But the door, the one she had entered through, was gone. The space where it had been was now just a solid wall, an unyielding barrier that kept her trapped in the dark hallway. "Hello!" Sophie's voice cracked as she called out into the darkness. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the scraping sound, now louder, as though the creature was drawing closer. Sophie's pulse raced as she turned in a circle, her eyes frantically scanning the hallway. She needed to get out. She needed to find a way to escape. And then she saw it. A shadow, no, a figure, emerged from the far end of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched and contorted in unnatural ways. The figure was draped in a tattered, black cloak that billowed around it like smoke, and its face, if it had one, was hidden beneath a dark hood. Sophie's blood ran cold. This wasn't the man who had warned her. This was something else, something far worse. The figure took a step forward, its long skeletal fingers reaching out toward her. Its mouth, the empty void where its mouth should have been, seemed to widen in a grotesque grin, and Sophie could feel the pull of its gaze, even though its face remained hidden. Her heart thundered in her chest, and for a moment, she couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead, and her body refused to obey her frantic command to run. The figure stepped closer, and with each movement, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. Sophie could hear the faintest whisper in the silence, a voice that seemed to echo from the very depths of her mind. "Come closer." She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and her eyes darted toward the only exit she could see, the stairs at the far end of the hallway. She had to get to them. She had to escape before it was too late. With every ounce of strength she had, Sophie forced herself to move, her feet stumbling as she rushed toward the stairs. But as she reached the bottom step, the figure's hand shot out, gripping her arm with inhuman strength. Sophie gasped as the cold fingers tightened around her wrist, sending shockwaves of terror coursing through her. The creature's grip was like ice, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the creature whispered, its voice like the scraping of nails against glass. Sophie's mind was a blur of panic as she twisted in its grasp, trying to break free. She had to get away. She had to. Suddenly, the world around her seemed to shift. The hallway twisted and warped, the walls bending and contorting as though the house itself were alive. The air grew thick with darkness, and the figure, now looming above her, grinned wider, its face now fully visible. Sophie's heart sank as she gazed into the creature's eyes. They were empty, hollow pits that seemed to draw her in, consuming her very soul. "You're not leaving," the creature said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You're never leaving." Sophie's mind screamed in terror as the figure's hand tightened once again, pulling her deeper into the abyss of the house. Sophie's body trembled in the creature's grip, her mind swirling with panic. The air seemed to grow denser, heavy with dread, as the dark figure's hollow eyes bore into hers. It was as if the creature was drawing out her very thoughts, feeding on her terror. Her breath came in short, frantic gasps, but she couldn't tear herself away. The house seemed to groan, as if alive, and Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. The darkness around her deepened, swallowing the faint light from the flickering candles. For a moment, she thought she might pass out, but then she felt it, the cold pressure of the creature's fingers tightening around her wrist like a vice. "You're never leaving." The words echoed in her mind, chilling her to the core. Sophie had always believed that the fear of the unknown was the worst kind of terror. But standing here, in the clutches of this nightmare, she realized that the thing before her was beyond her comprehension. It was a force, an entity that defied everything she had ever known. "Let go of me." Sophie's voice cracked as she tried to pull her arm free. Her pulse raced, and the panic rose like a tidal wave within her chest. She knew she had to escape, had to find a way out before this creature could do whatever it was planning. But the creature didn't seem to care for her struggles. Its grip tightened, its skin as cold as death, and Sophie's muscles screamed in protest as she tried to break free. The house seemed to close in around her, the walls shifting and warping with every breath she took. She could feel the pressure mounting, suffocating her, as if the very walls of the house were pressing in on her, urging her to give in. And then, just as Sophie thought she might lose all hope, something strange happened. The creature let go. It was as if the very air around her had frozen, and Sophie collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her hands clutching at her chest. She could feel her heart racing, the fear still gripping her like a vice, but now she was free to move. But the creature did not retreat. Instead, it stood there, its presence looming over her like a shadow that could never be escaped. The air seemed to crackle with tension, and Sophie felt a chill that went beyond the temperature of the room. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. The creature's hollow eyes met hers once again, and Sophie couldn't help but stare back, drawn to them, unable to look away. There was something hypnotic about its gaze, something that made her feel both terrified and strangely compelled to know more, to understand what it was. "Why do you want me?" Sophie thought, though the words never escaped her lips. She had to know what this thing wanted with her. She had to understand how she could survive whatever nightmare she had just unleashed. The creature's mouth twisted into a cruel smile, and Sophie felt her stomach drop. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a grin of hunger, of something much darker. "You shouldn't have come here," the creature whispered, its voice like the wind howling through a cracked window. "You've awakened what was sleeping. Now it won't rest until it's had you." Sophie's blood ran cold. Her mind raced to process the creature's words. "Awakened what?" She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat, strangled by fear. The creature stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. With each step, Sophie felt herself being drawn in, unable to move, unable to look away. "I am not what you think I am," it said, its voice reverberating in the dark, the words wrapped in an eerie echo. "I am the darkness beneath. I am the thing you've kept locked away for so long." Sophie's mind was spinning. What is it talking about? But before she could fully process the creature's words, it spoke again, its voice low and dangerous. "And now that I am free, I will take what is mine." Sophie stood frozen in place, the blood in her veins turning to ice. Her mind was racing with possibilities, trying to make sense of what was happening, but it was impossible. There was no logic in what she was experiencing, no way to understand the monster before her. Suddenly, the creature lunged at her, its movements quick and terrifyingly graceful. Sophie barely had time to react before it was upon her. Its hands, cold, clawed hands, reached for her, and she screamed, stumbling backward. But the creature was too fast. Its fingers grasped at her, pulling her toward the floor. Sophie's body crashed to the ground, the impact knocking the breath out of her. The creature hovered over her, its dark presence smothering her. Sophie gasped, struggling beneath its weight, but it was too strong. "You are mine now," the creature whispered in her ear, its voice like a caress and a threat all at once. "And there is nothing you can do to stop me." The world around her seemed to blur, and Sophie's vision swam as she fought to break free. She couldn't let this thing win. She couldn't let it claim her. But no matter how hard she struggled, no matter how much she screamed, Sophie could feel herself weakening. The creature's grip was unyielding, its cold touch draining the strength from her. It was as if the very essence of her being was being pulled from her, consumed by the darkness that surrounded her. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house. The walls shook, and for a brief moment, the creature's grip loosened. Sophie gasped for air, her head spinning, her body shaking from the effort of trying to free herself. The creature hissed in frustration, its grip tightening once again. But before it could finish what it had started, the house groaned louder, as if protesting the creature's presence. Sophie's heart raced as she glanced around, her eyes searching desperately for an escape. And then, from the shadows at the far end of the room, she saw something. A figure, a man. "Get away from her," the man shouted, his voice strained with fear. Sophie didn't know who he was, but she recognized the urgency in his tone. She could see the fear in his eyes, and it gave her the strength to fight back. The creature's eyes narrowed as it turned toward the man, its mouth opening in a silent snarl. The room seemed to vibrate with tension as the two figures faced each other. And then, without warning, the creature lunged at the man, its claws outstretched. Sophie screamed, her voice rising in a desperate plea for help. The world around her seemed to shatter as the creature descended on the man. But what would happen next? Would Sophie survive? Who was this mysterious figure? And could he save her from the nightmare she had unleashed? The creature's claws raked through the air, aiming for the man who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as the figure rushed forward, his arms outstretched, trying to intercept the creature's deadly strike. But the creature was fast, too fast. In an instant, it swiped at the man, its claws slashing across his chest, and he was thrown back against the wall with a sickening thud. Sophie's blood ran cold as she saw him crumple to the ground, his body twitching in the dim light. Her hope shattered like glass, and she screamed, helplessly. "No!" Sophie cried out, her voice strangled with fear. She had no idea who this man was, but he had tried to help her, and now the creature's attention was fully back on her. The creature's eyes glowed a deep, unnatural red, its gaze burning into Sophie with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It turned its head slowly, its neck creaking like an old door, and for the briefest moment, Sophie thought she saw something change in its expression. A flicker of annoyance, maybe even fury. And then, just as quickly, the creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. Its voice was guttural and low, vibrating through Sophie's bones. "You should have never come here," it whispered, each word dripping with malice. Sophie could feel the weight of its words pressing down on her, suffocating her. It was as if the very air in the room had turned to lead. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow, as she realized something terrifying. The creature had not only been waiting for her, it had been planning for this moment all along. Sophie had triggered something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. But she couldn't afford to give in to fear, not now. She could feel the coldness of the floor beneath her palms, and the tension in the air was unbearable, thick with the creature's presence. She needed a way out, fast. Desperately, Sophie glanced around the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, mocking her every attempt to escape. Her eyes darted to the door, the locked door. Was it still locked? Was it the key to her survival? But before she could move, the creature took another step toward her. Sophie froze, her eyes widening as the creature's claws scraped the ground, leaving deep gouges in the wooden floor. Its grin widened, if possible, and its voice purred like an unholy whisper. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. This house is mine, and I am part of it." The walls groaned once more, as if the house itself was groaning under the weight of the creature's words. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse echoing in her ears. She felt like a cornered animal, her every instinct screaming at her to flee. But there was no way out. The locked door. It was the only thing that had any chance of offering an escape. Sophie couldn't explain why, but something about it felt different now. She wasn't sure if it was the way the creature spoke about it or the strange pull she felt in her gut. But she knew that if she didn't try, there would be no escaping this nightmare. With a shaky breath, Sophie pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. The creature watched her, its unblinking eyes following her every movement. For a moment, it almost seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to attack or let her make her move. Sophie didn't wait for it to decide. She scrambled toward the locked door, her heart racing faster than ever. She could feel the creature's presence behind her, like a heavy shadow pressing down on her. But she didn't dare look back. Her fingers fumbled at the door handle. It was cold to the touch, sending a shiver down her spine. She twisted the knob and turned. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The locked door, was opening. But just as she was about to step through, she heard a low growl. The creature was right behind her, too close. She spun around just in time to see it lunge toward her, its claws outstretched and mouth gaping wide, ready to consume her. Sophie felt the air leave her lungs as she slammed the door shut, just inches from the creature's face. It screeched in fury, its claws scraping against the door, but it was too late. The door had sealed itself with a loud, resonating click. For a moment, there was silence. Sophie pressed her back against the door, her heart hammering in her chest, her body shaking with a mixture of fear and relief. She had escaped, at least for now, but she knew it wasn't over. The creature would find a way to get to her. It always did. She forced herself to breathe deeply, trying to calm the panic that threatened to overtake her. She glanced around the room she had entered, but it was unlike anything she had seen before. The walls were covered in strange symbols and markings, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, a presence that made Sophie's skin crawl. And then, she noticed something. A table at the far end of the room, covered with old books and papers. One book in particular caught her eye. It was bound in a dark, leathery material, its pages yellowed with age. She felt a strange pull toward it, a compulsion to open it. But as she reached for it, she heard something behind her, the sound of something scraping against the floor, slowly, deliberately. Sophie froze, her heart racing. The creature was not gone. It was still there, waiting for the right moment to strike. With a trembling hand, Sophie opened the book. As she flipped through the pages, she realized with a growing sense of horror that it wasn't a book at all. It was a journal. The journal of someone who had been trapped in this house long before her. The words on the pages were almost illegible, but one sentence stood out, scrawled hastily at the bottom of a page. The creature cannot be stopped. It is bound to the house. It waits for the one who will open the door, and when they do, it takes everything. Sophie's blood ran cold as the truth settled in. The door, the creature, the house, it was all connected. The creature had been waiting for her, and now that she had opened the door, she had unleashed something far worse than she could have ever imagined. The journal slipped from her hands as she heard the scraping sound again. Louder this time, closer. It was coming from the door. Sophie turned, her pulse pounding, and she saw the shadow beneath the door. Something was trying to get through. The creature was coming for her. The sound beneath the door grew louder, more urgent, like claws scratching against the wood, determined to break through. Sophie's breath came in shallow gasps, and she took a step back, her back pressed against the cold, damp wall behind her. Her heart was racing, pounding so loudly she feared the creature would hear it and tear her apart right there. Her eyes darted across the room, searching for anything that might help her escape, but it was too late. The door was the only exit, and she had already sealed it off. She couldn't go back to it. Desperately, Sophie looked around at the dark corners of the room, but the eerie glow of the symbols on the walls made everything appear like a nightmare in motion. Shadows danced, twisted into strange shapes, and the temperature dropped, sending chills down her spine. The presence in the room was suffocating. Every corner seemed to hold the weight of the house's terrible history. Then she heard it, the door creaked. The sound was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, as though something was pushing against it from the other side. The creature had started to break through. Sophie turned away, her feet stumbling as she moved toward the far corner of the room. There was no time left for thinking, only for acting. Her eyes landed on the table in the corner, the one with the strange book. It had slipped from her fingers earlier, but now the urge to return to it was stronger than ever. She had to know more about the creature, about this house, and the journal might hold the answers she needed to survive. But when she reached the table, she hesitated. Something felt wrong. The air had thickened, and a low hum vibrated through her, like an ancient chant coming from deep within the house. With trembling hands, she picked up the journal again, clutching it tightly to her chest. She turned to the first page, flipping through it, each one more illegible than the last. But then, as if by some cruel trick of fate, she found a part that was clearer. The ink was fresh, and the writing seemed urgent, desperate. "It wants you." Sophie froze. She read the line again, her pulse quickening. She turned the page, her hands shaking as she tried to read more. The journal spoke of the creature that haunted the house, how it was tied to the very fabric of the building, a nightmare that lived and breathed in the walls. And it was waiting for someone to open the door. "The door is a trap, a portal to the darkness," the journal read. "It calls to the weak-minded, the lost souls who stumble in. It waits for the moment when the door is opened, and then it feeds." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The journal's words were haunting. She didn't know if they were meant to warn her or trap her further in the house's grasp, but the meaning was clear. Whatever was on the other side of that door was far worse than anything she had imagined. And now that she had opened it, there was no going back. Suddenly, the creature's growls filled the air again, louder and more ferocious. The door trembled as if something on the other side was testing its strength, sensing the vulnerability of Sophie's fragile barrier. A wave of fear washed over her. She needed to do something, anything. She couldn't just stand there and wait for it to tear down the door. Sophie's eyes flickered to the walls, where the strange symbols still glowed faintly. One symbol caught her eye, different from the others. It was etched into the wall near the door, the one she had locked. It was larger than the rest, surrounded by jagged, dark lines. It almost seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were alive. Sophie didn't know why, but she was drawn to it. Moving quickly, she approached the wall and ran her hand over the symbol. The surface was rough, like it had been carved deep into the stone. As she touched it, she felt a shock, a sudden surge of cold that burned her skin, but she didn't pull away. Her fingers traced the symbol's edges, and in the back of her mind, she heard the whisper of words, a language she couldn't understand, but somehow, the meaning was clear. Then, as if she had triggered something, the room darkened further, the shadows closing in tighter, as if the house itself was trying to swallow her whole. Sophie's breath hitched as a low voice echoed through the room. So low, so guttural, that it felt like it was coming from inside her own mind. "You shouldn't have touched it." The voice wasn't the creature's. It was something far older, darker, and far more ancient. Sophie's eyes widened in terror. She turned to face the door again. The growling had stopped. All that was left was a suffocating silence, as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting. A sharp, scraping noise echoed in the quiet, then a loud bang against the door. It was coming. Sophie backed away from the wall, clutching the journal to her chest, her eyes darting frantically for an escape. She couldn't stay here, not with whatever that voice was, and not with the creature so close. Her gaze shifted toward the far corner of the room, where a darkened doorway led deeper into the house. Sophie wasn't sure where it led, but it was her only option now. With a final, terrified glance at the door, she sprinted toward the doorway, ignoring the sharp pain in her side as she stumbled over the cold, uneven floor. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind her, the soft, scraping sound of something moving across the room, growing louder and louder. Sophie didn't look back. She couldn't. She reached the doorway and flung it open, her heart racing. The darkness inside was oppressive, suffocating, but she didn't have a choice. She stepped through it, the door slamming shut behind her, and she plunged deeper into the unknown. The air was colder here, colder than anything she had ever felt before. The floor beneath her feet was damp, and the smell of mildew and rot filled her nose. But it was silent, at least for now. Sophie swallowed her fear, forcing herself to breathe steadily. She had no idea what was ahead, but she couldn't stop now. Not with the creature so close, not with the house still breathing and shifting around her. And then, in the distance, she saw something, just the faintest glimmer of light. It was dim, flickering like a dying flame, but it was enough to give her hope. Sophie began to walk toward it, determined to find out what lay ahead, even as the terrible voice echoed in her mind. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Sophie's heart raced as she moved deeper into the house, her every step echoing in the cold, stagnant air. The faint light ahead flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. It seemed like it was calling to her, pulling her forward, but each step felt heavier than the last. Something about the place felt wrong, more than just the weight of fear in her chest. It felt as if the very walls were alive, watching, breathing. The sound of her footsteps was the only noise, and even that seemed to grow muffled, as if the house itself wanted to stifle her presence. The dark hallway stretched endlessly before her, each turn leading to a deeper void of uncertainty. Sophie's eyes darted from side to side, but she couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for her to make a mistake. The light was growing brighter now, but so was the oppressive darkness that surrounded it. The shadows seemed to move, twitching like they were alive, creeping up the walls, pulling the space around Sophie tighter, suffocating her. Sophie forced herself to breathe slowly, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of her heart. She couldn't let fear control her. She needed to be strong, to find out what was happening here. She needed answers, and this light, it was the only clue she had. She reached the end of the hallway and paused before the open door. The faint light flickered inside, barely enough to illuminate the room beyond, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. The door creaked as she pushed it open wider, revealing a room that looked like something out of a nightmare. The air inside was thick with dust, and the room smelled of rot and decay. Old furniture was strewn around haphazardly, covered in sheets so old they had turned yellow with age. Cobwebs hung in the corners, swaying gently, as though stirred by some unseen presence. But it wasn't the furniture that made Sophie freeze in place. It was the walls. The walls were covered in symbols she recognized. They were the same markings from the journal, the ones she had seen earlier. They were scrawled all over the walls, twisted and contorted into shapes that made her head spin, as if the very design of the room was designed to drive her mad. The flickering light came from an old oil lamp sitting on a table in the center of the room. But as Sophie stepped further inside, she noticed something strange. The lamp wasn't casting its glow on the floor or the walls. No, the light was being drawn upwards, toward the ceiling, like something was pulling it into the very heart of the room. She took another hesitant step forward, her breath catching in her throat. The symbols seemed to pulse with a life of their own, glowing faintly in the dim light. It was as though the room itself was alive, breathing, waiting. Sophie's hands trembled as she reached out to touch one of the symbols. The moment her fingers brushed against the wall, the room seemed to shift. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and a low, guttural sound vibrated in the air, like the walls were groaning under the weight of some immense pressure. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice hissed from the darkness. Sophie spun around, her heart in her throat. But there was no one there. The room was empty. Empty except for the symbols, the lamp, and the sense of impending doom that hung thick in the air. The voice had been real. She had heard it, felt it inside her very bones. But who had spoken? What was it? She took a step back, her eyes scanning the room frantically. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening crash. Sophie jumped, her breath catching in her chest. The sound reverberated through the room, and for a moment, everything was still. But then, a low, scraping noise began, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. Sophie's pulse quickened. She knew she wasn't alone. Something was inside the walls, moving toward her. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, as though something or someone was trying to break through. Sophie's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. The symbols seemed to glow brighter now, their twisted shapes warping and shifting as if alive, like they were reaching out to her. A sudden flash of light, bright and blinding, erupted from the lamp. Sophie gasped and shielded her eyes. When she opened them again, the room had changed. The symbols had vanished, replaced by dark, jagged cracks that ran across the walls, as though the very fabric of the room was tearing apart. And then she saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, slowly taking shape. First, it was just a shadow, its outline flickering and distorting. But then, as it stepped into the dim light, Sophie could make out its features, or rather, its lack of features. The creature was a shape, a dark silhouette with no discernible face, no eyes, no mouth, just a void where a person's features should have been. Its body seemed to shimmer, rippling like a mirage, and as it moved closer, Sophie could hear the faintest sound, like whispers on the wind. "You should have never opened the door," it repeated, its voice coming from all directions, swirling around Sophie like 1,000 voices. "You can never leave now." The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing tighter and tighter as the creature approached. Sophie backed away, her mind reeling with terror. What was it? What was it doing here? "It's too late," the creature whispered. "You are already part of the house now. There is no escape." Sophie's breath was ragged, her pulse racing as the creature stepped closer. She could feel the air grow colder, the temperature dropping rapidly until her breath fogged in front of her. She could almost taste the darkness in the air, the thick, suffocating presence of something ancient and malicious. Sophie turned to run, but before she could move, the creature reached out. A sharp pain pierced her chest, like icy fingers digging into her very soul. She gasped, her knees buckling as the room around her twisted and spun. Her vision blurred, and she could feel herself being pulled into the darkness. The last thing Sophie saw before everything went black was the creature's void-like face, staring into her soul, its whispered words echoing in her mind. "You will never escape." Sophie awoke to an eerie silence. The darkness around her was oppressive, thick and all-consuming, like a blanket that smothered her senses. Her body felt heavy, as though she had been drugged, and her limbs ached as if she had been bound for hours. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths, but she couldn't move, couldn't even open her eyes for a moment. The memory of the creature's touch lingered in her mind like a cold shiver. Her heart pounded in her chest, racing as if she had been running through the dark, but her body was still. Her fingers twitched, and slowly, cautiously, she forced her eyelids to lift. It wasn't the room she had seen earlier. It was different. Dim light filtered in from somewhere above, and the walls around her were smooth, almost featureless. A chill hung in the air, but it wasn't the same biting cold as before. It was colder, but not unbearable. Just a constant, uncomfortable presence that made her skin crawl. Sophie sat up slowly, her head swimming as the room spun around her. Her mind was a blur, struggling to piece together the disorienting memories of what had happened before she blacked out. She remembered the creature, the whispering darkness, the cold touch, the words that rattled her very soul. But what happened after that? How had she ended up here? She tried to stand but collapsed back onto the cold, stone floor. Her legs felt weak, like they had been drained of all strength. The stone under her fingertips was slick, moist, almost as if the room itself was sweating in fear. Panic began to rise within her chest. Where was she? What was this place? Had she been taken? And most importantly, what had happened to the creature? She pushed herself up again, this time making it to her knees, and looked around. The room she was in was small, barely large enough to fit a bed and a narrow, dimly lit window that was covered by grime and dust. The walls were solid stone, not the rotting, decaying wood of the house she had been in before. There was no furniture, no warmth, just emptiness and cold. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. A low, scratching noise, like nails dragging against stone. It was coming from behind her, from the shadows where the light barely reached. Sophie's heart jumped in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. The air grew heavier, thicker with dread. She turned her head slowly, terrified of what she might see. And there, in the corner of the room, near the far wall, something shifted. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving slowly, like it was made of darkness itself. Sophie froze. Her blood ran cold. There, in the dim light, she could see the silhouette of a man, or what used to be a man. The figure was hunched, its body unnaturally bent and twisted, as if the very act of standing upright was an effort. It was the creature, but it was different. It looked less like the shadow it had been before and more like a physical presence now. An unnatural, broken thing that had somehow escaped the confines of its dark prison. Its eyes, or what might have been eyes, glowed faintly, an eerie, sickly yellow that made Sophie's stomach churn. The creature stepped closer, its footsteps silent on the stone floor, its body swaying with each movement. Sophie's throat went dry, her mouth parched. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. "You should not have woken up," the creature whispered, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. Sophie's pulse thundered in her ears. The creature's hollow gaze fixed on her, and for a moment, it seemed to take pleasure in her fear. The air around her thickened, the temperature dropping even further, until her teeth were chattering uncontrollably. "You were never supposed to see this," the creature murmured, taking another step closer. Sophie scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the cold floor as she tried to get away, but there was nowhere to run. She was trapped in the small, claustrophobic room, and the creature was closing in on her with every passing second. "You belong here now," the creature hissed, its voice growing louder, more distorted. Suddenly, The wall behind Sophie shook, a deep rumbling that vibrated through the stone like an earthquake. The room seemed to shudder in response, and the dim light flickered. Sophie's heart raced even faster, her breath quickening in panic. What was happening? Why was the room shaking? Without warning, the stone wall behind her cracked open, a jagged split running from floor to ceiling. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, a void that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Sophie's eyes widened in terror. "No one ever escapes," the creature rasped, its voice now echoing in her mind. A cold wind surged from the dark opening in the wall, blowing Sophie's hair back and pushing her forward toward the crack. Her body moved as though it was being dragged, despite her best efforts to fight it. The creature's grip on her soul was tightening, suffocating her. "You will join us," it whispered, its face now inches from hers. The smell of decay and rot filled her nostrils as its hollow eyes stared into her soul. The dark void beyond the wall pulsed, almost alive, as if it were a breathing entity. Sophie could feel the pull of the darkness, the irresistible force drawing her toward it, like gravity. Her vision blurred, and the edges of the room seemed to melt away. She could no longer tell where the room ended and the dark void began. Sophie's body went rigid. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The creature's whispers filled her mind, drowning out everything else. "Come closer," it whispered, the voice now a cacophony of hissing sounds. "Embrace the darkness." And then, just as Sophie felt her mind slipping away, just as the darkness threatened to swallow her whole, she saw something. A flicker of light. A single, brief flash of light, like the glimmer of hope in a vast, endless abyss. The light was faint, but it was real. It was a sign. Sophie forced her legs to move, to push through the paralyzing fear, to break free of the creature's hold. She reached out for the light, her fingers trembling as they brushed against something solid. Her vision cleared, and she could see it. A door. A door at the far end of the room, just beyond the crack in the wall. It was barely visible in the darkness, but Sophie knew it was her only chance. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Sophie pushed herself to her feet, stumbling toward the door. The creature screamed in fury behind her, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You can't escape," it howled. "You will never escape." But Sophie didn't listen. She didn't dare. With one final, desperate push, she reached the door, her fingers closing around the handle. And then, she yanked it open. Sophie's heart raced, her fingers gripping the door handle like a lifeline. The cold, clammy sweat on her palms made it difficult to keep hold, but she didn't dare let go. The creature's wails echoed behind her, a twisted cacophony of rage and despair that sent chills down her spine. The door creaked open slowly, its hinges groaning with age, and Sophie stepped through it without hesitation. The air beyond was stale, thick with the scent of dust and decay. She didn't know what she was expecting. Perhaps a way out, a hidden escape route, or some sort of salvation. But what she found was far worse than anything she could have imagined. On the other side of the door was another room, but this one was nothing like the stone walls and darkness she had just fled. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and the floor creaked beneath her feet as if the entire house was groaning in protest. The room was dimly lit, with only a few candles flickering weakly on a nearby table, casting long, eerie shadows across the space. Sophie glanced around, her breath caught in her throat. In the far corner of the room, an old, dusty mirror hung crookedly on the wall. At first, it looked like a normal mirror, but as she stepped closer, her stomach churned. The reflection staring back at her was not her own. It was the creature. Its twisted, contorted form was mirrored perfectly, standing just behind her, its eyes glowing yellow with malice. Sophie gasped and spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. There was nothing there. Her mind raced, the terror consuming her. Had she imagined it? Was the creature somehow inside the mirror, trapped in another dimension? She couldn't tell. Her head was spinning, her thoughts a blur of panic. But then, she noticed something else. On the far side of the room, a large, heavy chest sat in the corner, its lid half open. From where she stood, Sophie could see a faint glow emanating from within, like something was alive inside the chest. She didn't know why, but her feet began moving toward it, drawn by an irresistible force. With each step, the whispers of the creature grew louder in her mind. You should not have opened the door. You were never meant to know the truth. But Sophie was beyond fear. She had already come this far, and there was no turning back. She had to know. As she reached the chest, she hesitated for a moment. The air felt thick, the weight of 1,000 unspoken secrets pressing down on her. With a trembling hand, she pushed the lid all the way open. Inside the chest was an old, tattered journal, its pages yellowed with age. The faint glow was coming from the journal's pages, and as Sophie reached for it, the creature's voice whispered again, now full of anguish. You have no idea what you are about to unleash. Ignoring the warning, Sophie opened the journal, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. The words were written in a language she couldn't understand, but they seemed to pulse with a dark energy that made her head ache. As she flipped through the pages, one particular entry caught her eye. The date at the top of the page was recent, just days ago. The entry was written in English, and it sent a cold shiver through her. The door has been unlocked. The creature has escaped. The nightmare has begun. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. What did this mean? How could it be? She wasn't the first to open the door. She looked up, and the mirror caught her gaze again. This time, it wasn't just the creature that she saw. In the reflection, Sophie saw the figure of a man, standing behind her in the room. He was tall, his features blurred and indistinct, but his eyes were cold and empty. She spun around, but again, there was no one there. Panic rose in her chest. The reflection wasn't just showing her the creature, it was showing something far worse. The man in the mirror was real. The creature's whispers filled her ears once more, but this time they weren't just words. They were an overwhelming force, pushing into her mind. You cannot stop it. You cannot leave. The door has opened, and it will never be closed again. Sophie's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, clutching the journal to her chest. She couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, the walls closing in on her. The darkness was consuming her once again. But then, through the chaos, she heard something else. A voice. A real voice. Not the creature's, but someone else's. Sophie, it was her mother's voice. Sophie's eyes shot open, and she scrambled to her feet, her body shaking. She turned toward the source of the voice, her heart racing. In the doorway stood a figure. A woman, pale and tired-looking, her face obscured by shadows. It was her mother, at least it looked like her mother. "Sophie, you don't belong here," the woman said softly, her voice filled with sorrow. "You never did." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. What is happening? The woman stepped forward, and as she did, the shadows around her seemed to reach out, wrapping around her like tendrils. Her figure began to distort, flickering, as if she were fading in and out of existence. "No," Sophie whispered, stumbling backward. "No, no, no." The woman's eyes locked onto hers, and in an instant, Sophie understood. The creature had not only taken the house, it had taken everything. It was not just in the walls or behind locked doors. It was in the very fabric of reality itself. With one final, terrifying shriek, the woman in the doorway vanished into the shadows, leaving Sophie alone once again. And then, it all went black.